In this fourth video of the Music Appreciation series, we will examine the family of percussion instruments. Percussion instruments are defined as instruments that produce a sound by striking, shaking, or scraping. It should be mentioned that the percussion instruments are the oldest family. If you are a percussion player, your job is not simply to master to play one, but many, if not all, of these instruments. Because percussion instruments are so simple to make, it is common for us to find various percussion instruments from around the world being used today. The primary job, however, of these instruments is simply to keep a beat and set the tempo or speed of music. I can further categorize percussion instruments based upon whether or not they play pitch. If they do play pitch, as is in the case of a xylophone, glockenspiel, or chimes, it would allow me to play melodies. Most percussion instruments, however, do not play pitch and are simply used to keep a steady beat. This includes most of the drums, along with various auxiliary percussion instruments like the tambourine, cymbals, guiro, and many, many others. Here we'll take just a quick tour of various percussion instruments. The first instrument that we hear and see is known by many names, but most commonly the xylophone. Here we see a pitched instrument with wooden bars, and because it has wooden bars, we could also call this a marimba. Notice that it is arranged very much like a piano keyboard in that it has the sharps and flats above the natural notes. Like the keyboard, it also has the lower notes on the left side with the shorter bars, meaning the higher notes, on the right side. Should the bars be made not from wood but from metal, you could also call this a vibraphone, which is even more evident when you see a foot pedal at the bottom to sustain pitch. Similar to the xylophone is the instrument known as the chimes. Here, however, though, we see that the pipes are now suspended in the air, and instead of playing with a felt or yarn mallet, they are now using these wooden mallets to play. Unlike the xylophone, you do not strike the center of the keys. Instead, with the chimes, you would want to strike the top of each tube with your hammer to produce a sound which is reminiscent of a church bell or even doorbells. Finally, we see here the glockenspiel, also known as the orchestra bells. These are very small, and because of that, they have a very high-pitched, bright, and shrill sound, often played with plastic or even metal mallets. Unlike the previous instruments, with the timpani, we actually now have a drum that allows us to change pitch. These large copper bowls have a drum head then stretched atop, made out of plastic or calfskin. Unlike other drums, however, I can actually change how tight and how loose that drum skin is based upon the foot pedal found at the base. The last pitched percussion instrument that we'll look at is the piano. The piano is considered by many to be the most popular percussion instrument in the world. Sound is produced by striking the hammers, and we will learn more about the keyboard family in a later episode. Now we're moving on to the non-pitched percussion. And the first one we see is probably the largest and loudest member, known as the bass drum. Here, we would play it on its side, and using a soft sheep wool mallet, we can actually produce a very loud sound. Similar to the bass drum, in much smaller form, is the snare drum. Here, we have these metal wires or coils known as snares attached at the bottom. When struck at the top, those snares would then vibrate, giving us a distinctive rattling sound. By combining the snare drum with the bass drum, alongside other percussion instruments like the cymbals and toms, I can then create a modern drum set. A perfect example of how simple some percussion instruments can be is found here with the triangle. All we simply do is strike that triangle with a metal beater to get a nice bright sound. Earlier, we saw that cymbals could be used in a drum set, and here we see two examples of those. Here we have, at the bottom, the hi-hat cymbal, which can be opened and closed with the use of our left foot. Beside it, on its right there, is something known as the suspended, or ride cymbal. It is also possible for us to see simply two cymbals held by hand and what we consider to be crash cymbals. Here we have the gong. Now the gong is a large round disc suspended by a metal frame and, like the cymbals, can be struck with a soft mallet. Now, depending upon the size of the gong, it might make a really loud crashing rumble or just a very small bright ting. Tambourine is one of those percussion instruments that can be played both by shaking it or by striking it. Those small discs, known as jingles, is what produces the sound when we shake it or strike it. Our final two instruments in our brief tour are the castanets, which are two pieces of hard wood, which are then shaped like a shell that are hinged together, and they can either be played by shaking them or by striking them together. Finally, we see an example of an instrument that is scraped to make a sound, and this is known as the güiro. This comes to us from South Central America, and sometimes this gourd has been made from an actual vegetable. All you simply do is rub that wooden stick to produce a nice sound. In our next video, we will examine in further detail the keyboard subgroup of the percussion family.